Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
If they don't hear it, I say it more loudly. It's a pleasure to be here. As Dr. Brown said, I came to Georgetown in 1958. In fact, it had only 3 buildings. The Healy building in the chapel, and the building on the right when you entered from main gate, which was just one gate, O Street, 3700. The G Street bus would come and make a turn from P Street onto 37. There was actually an observatory at the other end with a huge ditch in between. I will tell you a little more about this because I see a lot of old faces, so I think you may remember some of this stuff. Father Hayden was the head of the observatory, which was really a very well-known observatory with good reputation. Father Bunn was the president. I think he was the president from 52 to 64, and I came in 58, so I was exactly in the middle of his time, and I was here on the campus 64 after having taught at Swarthmore College for a year. And he was still here, but then he changed his position. We had 2 Indians, because we had a Jesuit priest from Madras called Father Thekekara. So he had brought 2, one Hindu and one Christian with him. So I have very fond memories of this thing, and the observatory where I worked for the first summer because I needed some money. Father Thekekara was studying titanium, and I helped analyze some of that data. He was paying me $1.25 an hour. And when I said to him I needed a little more money, he looked at me and said, "You're a small man, you don't need more." I was much smaller than I look now in the thing. Anyway, so it's a very old tradition for Georgetown, and it had a very good physics department. But since I had studied fiqh and tafsir for years and years with my father, I actually had spent more time before and since on Hani Tajweed. You can't hear me. All right. So I actually know a little bit about law, and I know a lot about fiqh. And actually tafsir. This particular topic has been handled, discussed at our Teachers Institute in Abbey Cube, New Mexico, for over 15 years. So it's not a new topic to us. And I shouldn't have to say it, but I probably should because of the way people try to look for hidden agendas. We don't have a hidden agenda, we are teachers. And we say it as it is, sometimes at the risk of getting a lot of people upset, including Muslims. But we go to the original sources and we don't go by propaganda. So anyways, so the first part that I'm going to talk about, which is this thing here, what is this? Here is what Khalid Blankenship was supposed to say. And not there, so Jonathan is going to say that, and I don't know whether he's going to cover that or not. Let's first talk about what the importance of the topic is. And the importance of the topic really isn't ISIS. ISIS are new players. They have no credibility. No one really cares about them, especially among Muslims, especially among scholars. It's a flash that will go away like many other flashes have. But the fact is that the Muslim people, the majority Muslim countries actually are in favor of, quote, an Islamic State. And they have no idea what that means. They have no idea what that means, just as Pakistanis had no idea that they just formed the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. My father was a part of that thing simply because it was freedom. And there was never really a talk. When I came to Georgetown, no one asked about the Islamic State because it was not a topic. The Jesuits were not interested in it. And my philosophy professors, they were not interested in it. The grassroots see the Sharia actually simply as something that works. And they think it's a solution to the corruption in their governments and in their countries. The outsiders, however, I just call it in general, the outsiders claim that they want to establish a worldwide caliphate that will be oppressive to women and for the non-Muslims. So it is still, this topic is not going away. So the question is, do they derive, whoever they are, do they derive their authority from the Quran or the Sunnah? And there's another group that has, it's not new, I call them statists. Instead of talking about the Quran or the Sunnah, they want to establish, quote, a state. And we'll talk a little bit about that because the state that they want to establish is not an Islamic state by any stretch of the imagination. It's a modern state where all power resides in the government. Now, the way my mind works, the first thing I want us to do is to say, let's define some terms. What do we mean by a state? And I'm not going to go too into it. We have unions, we have commonwealth, we have federations. The United States itself is not a state, it's the United States. And actually we have, 3 commonwealths? So they're not all
Pennsylvania
states.
and Massachusetts. Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts.
3.
Yeah.
So 3 commonwealths. And we need to think about why they are called commonwealths. In the Arabic terminology, Muslim terminology, the word sultan actually appears a lot in the Quran. And it is still used, and sultan is power, might, authority, and so on. But the only sultan we have in the Muslim countries now is, I think, the Oman. Is that the only sultan?
Oman.
Brunei is a sultan. Okay.
Malaysia has a federation of sultans.
That's a federation. You still have a bunch of sultans, and they have no power. They just rotate and claim something. The dawla is the word used a lot. In fact, ISIS started by calling itself the Dawla al-Arabiya fil Iraq wa Sham. That's where the Daesh comes from. And people say, well, that's not who they are. Well, actually that's what they call themselves, and the rest of the Muslim world still call them Daesh. So it's a Dawla. Mamlaka just means the things that we own And we have a lot of mamlakas. Mamlaka al-Saudiya al-Arabiya, which means the things that are owned by this corporation called Saudi Arabia. And then we have the word Khilafah. Well, the word Khilafah or Khalifa is the singular. The word Khalifa is used in the Quran only twice. One in relationship with Adam, where God says to the angels, "Inna ja'alnaka fil ardi khalifa," that we are going to appoint a Khalifa. And I want to spend a few minutes to talk about what that means. And the second time it is used for David. And it says, "Oh David, we have appointed you the Khalifa to do justice between people by truth without following your own desires." So it doesn't say you have the authority to do whatever you want. It simply says you have a responsibility to do justice, and if you use your own desires, you are going to be in trouble. The Quran uses the word khulafa a lot, the plural, and it uses in the sense of people succeeding each other. So when one nation is an authority, they fall, another group comes, and the Quran says, now you succeeded the other people. So it's clearly successor, and I think all translators do successor. I just quickly went through this thing here, and I have a habit of doing that. Among the recent translations, during the 20th century, we have Ashraf Ali Thanwi, and those of you who know something about it, he was a great scholar from Deoband, and he wrote his thing by Al-Quran in Urdu, and he actually says, you are a subordinate. He calls it a naib. A naib is a subordinate, if you want, deputy, but certainly not a boss. Muhammad Ali calls it a ruler. I think it's important to, one of the reasons I do this is I want people to understand that the translators don't translate in vacuum. So it depends upon the time and the place where they are and what perspective they bring to it. Muhammad Ali is a part of the Ahmadiyya movement, and they split, and he went one direction and he wrote a lot of stuff in English, and he wants to emphasize the fact that we are going to have rulers come from that group, and he makes a big point out of calling this a ruler. Well, Pickthall, I couldn't find the date on the thing I had, he called it viceroy. Well, he's English, so the only thing he could think of as the deputy is the second to the Roy rather than anything else. And Yusuf Ali, who wanted to impress us that he's writing in good English, he calls it vicegerent, which no one knows, and if you look it up you may be able to find what it means, but it kind of means viceroy, but not quite the same. And the N.J. Dawood, and I put some dates in here, N.J. Dawood, who was an Iraqi, I believe Iraqi Christian, he decided to kind of explain it. So he says, the one who shall rule as my representative, as my successor, God's saying. And Abulala Maududi just uses the word Khalifa, and I think deliberately because he was a statist. He wanted to establish a state, and Khalifa had acquired a meaning in Urdu that meant you have some kind of an authority. And Thomas Cleary, which you may or may not have heard of, who's a linguist, he simply went back to deputy. So overall, the Khalifa just means deputy, at the most, with no authority independent of the authority given to the deputy and whoever the chief is, which is God. Okay, I want to very quickly go to what happens at the beginning. And I may not be looking at this thing because I get distracted when I have this thing in front of me. When the Prophet ﷺ died, contrary to the general impression, the people didn't just run around, gathered together and said, Abu Bakr, you are our Khalifa, the Khalifa of the Prophet. In fact, the Muslims of Medina itself were divided into at least 3 groups, well-defined groups. The group of Banu Hashim centered around Ali, but actually the meetings were all in the house of Fatima, the Prophet's daughter. And they continued to meet in her house for as long as she lived, which was 6 months. And they claimed that the Khalifa, the one who succeeds the Prophet, should be within the family of the Prophet, which they claim to be them. In fact, since there was no male heir, they said that was Ali. The rest of the Quraysh in Medina had a very high regard for Abu Bakr, and they were willing to accept him as the leader. And then the third group was, we call them Ansar, but in fact there were many, many tribes, and they were not really united. The Aus and Khazraj and many, many others. But they were willing to choose one of them by saying, well, you know, the Prophet was here, we accepted his authority, but now that he's gone, we think one of us should have the authority. So they met in this house of Abu Sa'id, and Sa'ad, the chief, was actually sick. But they were meeting there, and Ali Umar found out, and he grabbed Abu Bakr and he says, we better go there because we don't know what they're going to do, and then we'll have to clean up the mess. So they went there and they were talking about how the Ansar had the right to have the authority because they took care of the Prophet and they gave him shelter. And in fact, they said there are more of us than you. And actually explicitly says, you know, we gave you shelter. So they did not consider them as citizens in any sense of the word. They were still visitors. That is not unusual in the old world. You can be in a place for generations and you are still wherever you came from. But the whole thing was that one of them wanted to be the leader. And Abu Bakr spoke up to say, well, look, there are Muslims now, mu'mineen, outside of this town. And they will not accept the authority of a non-Quraysh. Quraysh being the most respected tribe, which had the authority, the control over Mecca, in the holy places way back then, will be accepted to people more easily, not unquestionably, but more easily. And he said, well, here are 2 people I have, choose Umar or this other guy. It doesn't matter who the other guy is because no one was going to think about him. And actually the things didn't get calm. If you read the literature, you find that people got very heated, swords were drawn, and things were getting pretty ugly. So Umar immediately took the hand of Abu Bakr and says, I do bay'ah on your hands. And he had already told the gathering that Abu Bakr is the best among them, and quoted the stories. He was the second one in the cave, and he was appointed by the Prophet to lead the prayer, and many of those things, which no one could deny. So when he did it, the others followed, first from the Quraysh and then from the things. So here is the so-called quick election. It was pretty ugly. The next morning, the Prophet now is still not buried. The next morning, before the prayer, Umar stood up and told people to do the bay'ah of Abu Bakr. And they did. Somewhere in here, I think it's important to look at the first statements they make. I call them inaugural addresses, which is what we call them today. And instead of, doing the exact translation, what we end up with things like I'll do so and so, inshallah, there are lots of inshallahs in it. You can just look at what they said. And he said, and Umar had said, and he is the best among us. So the first thing Abu Bakr said was, I've been given authority over you, and I'm not the best among you. The second thing was, if I do well, help me. If I don't do well, correct me. And the third was, the weak among you will be strong with me until I have restored their rights to them, and the strong among you will be weak towards me until I have taken away your rights from them. Obey me if I obey God, and if I don't obey God and His Messenger, you owe me nothing. So you can see what the messages are, and I don't have to go and analyze it. When Abu Bakr was sick, he knew from experience that if he just leaves it to the process, we'll have an ugly scene again. So he talked to individual people, the so-called well-known leaders, and said, I'm going to nominate Umar. There was not unanimity. In fact, almost everybody said, well, he's a good man, but he's harsh. And Abu Bakr says, well, he's harsh because I'm soft. When I'm gone, he will become soft. In any case, he writes it down and announces it to the general public, and he gets elected. Umar actually becomes soft, and he turns out to be a very good administrator. And I have, let's see if I have it. Here is what he said. There's 5 things. I will not exact any taxes or levies that are not authorized by law. The very first thing he said. All lawfully realized taxes will be used only in your interest. 3, it is my duty to protect the frontiers of your lands. Guess what is missing? Conquer new lands. Simply says, I'm going to defend the frontiers of your land. It is my duty to protect your prosperity and look after your interests. And it is my obligation to do justice. And the reason it's important to look at these inaugural addresses is that they sound very modern. Because these were concepts that were not that well known among the people, except the people did have a tradition of consulting with each other. And when they called him the Khalifa, he actually ridiculed it. He said, well, Abu Bakr was the Khalifa of the Prophet, so who am I the Khalifa of? Am I the Khalifa of Abu Bakr? And then who will be my successor, the Khalifa of Umar, who's the Khalifa of Abu Bakr? I mean, this is ridiculous. Because he took it only as meaning a successor. Nothing with authority or anything. But being smart, when someone said, Amir al-Mu'mineen, he said, that's a good one. Guess why that is a good one? It has the word Amr in it. He will have an authority. I give you a little short list, and I don't know whether we are going to make a copy of some of these. Homer actually...
How would you translate into English Amir al-Mu'mineen?
The Amir, the one who has the authority to give instructions of the believers. Amir is just the one who has the authority of Amr, which is just instruction.
So it has nothing to do with commander.
Why?
Military commander.
No,
It means
no.
commander. I mean, if you,
Well,
you
no, but
try,
I mean, in his, from the original.
yeah, I mean, the Amir, but Amir also means
Prince.
or leader, just someone who has authority.
Okay. Because nowadays they translate it as commander of the faithful,
Well,
which sounds odd to me.
well, one of the things is that if you start thinking of these things in the current terms, which later became the term, that's the problem, which is what I'm trying to
Right.
to correct. Amir, I asked one person once, I said, so when does someone become a sheikh? And he said, $10 million. And of course now $10 million is not enough. So anyone who has $10 million is a sheikh, which literally means an old man, a leader, someone to be respected and so on. Anyways, here is a list of things, and the most important thing in here is he permitted business people from the belligerent nations to come and do business. He established allowances for the poor of the Christians and the Jews. I mean, these are all kind of modern ideas. We consider them. He announced daily allowances for people who took care of the street children. I mean, literally street children. And we don't think they were, but they were street children, and so on. I'm gonna not spend too much, but Umar then had a big problem in naming his successor, because there was no one he could name that everyone would as easily get behind as they got behind him, because Abu Bakr said he's a good man. So he appointed a committee. Sounds familiar? And the people who put on the committee are all from the Ashara Mubashara, the 10 who were given the good news by the Prophet ﷺ. We have a little disagreement as to who they are, but these certainly are among them. The one that is missing is Abu Bakr and Umar, who are also among the Ashara Mubashara. And these people actually had a problem. They discussed it, and one of the things they were mentioning is, well, what model are we going to follow? And one of the things that they constantly came up is, whoever we choose have to follow the model of Abu Bakr and Umar. And Ali said no, and Uthman said yes, and that is how Uthman became the next one. Okay. Okay, that's it, I think. Yeah, because I'm going into now what would have been Khalid's, because I have notes on Khalid's still, because I end up doing it when I have to. So that's it. There was no concept of a Khalifa as the ultimate ruler with all the authority. This nonsense of someone called himself Abu Bakr and he's a Sayyid, and our press keeps on saying, well, that means he's a Khalifa by definition, and he is a Khalifa has the religious and temporal authority by definition. That's what our press keeps on saying. That's not true. So I'm going to leave it here that in the beginning there is no such thing as a Khalifa with a thing. The idea is there, and I'll leave it to Dr. Brown.
Do you, maybe, because I emailed myself something which I have to follow up, so maybe if you want to answer some questions while I do that, then I can start. So, does anybody have any questions in the meantime? But we can't have a lot of questions, just...
Professor, do you think that this problem of succession,
Yes.
at the beginning,
Yes.
it's not, I don't think, unique to this area, but do you think that translates in today's problems also? The real problem of successions of governments, there is no successor, nobody chooses a successor, and there's a revolution or the military takes over. Do you see some connection there?
No, because what we have are modern states. So we don't have the old traditional states. The old traditional people actually were simpler, even though we think they're complicated. They were tribal systems. And each tribe had their own system. And if they wanted a higher person, they'll get together and choose one. Okay? And they'll say, you are not really better than us, but you can do stuff. That tribal system actually still exists in many Muslim countries. And in fact, to the extent that the tribal system exists, the modern governments have problems with them. Because you cannot force them to do anything they don't want to do. I mean, Palestine is a problem partly because Palestinians, they're small mountain villages. Okay? They are independent thinking people. Afghanistan, in the western Pakistan, they're all tribal people. And if they slowly move to something, it works. But forcing them to do something doesn't work. So I don't think the problem is the old problem of succession, because it was decided that we are not going to agree, and leadership is going to be local. And I'm not going to get to that because Dr. Brown is going to handle it. Yes.
How does Malik come into this story?
Malik just means a king.
Yeah. But what did the Prophet say about Maliks?
The ones who own something.
He says a Malik cannot go to heaven.
Well, I don't think he said that. But the thing is that
he didn't like Malik.
Well, I mean, the Quran talks about the Bani Israel asking the Prophet to name a Malik for them, a king for them, and they didn't like the one he named. And the only negative about the word Malik in the Quran is where Bilqis, the Queen of Sheba, receives a letter from David, from Sulaiman, and she says to the people, I've received this letter, give me your expert opinion. Called fatwa. Give me your fatwa. And they said, well, we are strong and blah blah blah, and we can defeat him. And she said, I think we are not going to want a confrontation. إن الملوك إذا دخلوا قرية أفسدوها وجعلوا أعزة أهلها أذلة وكذلك يفعلون. When the kings enter a town, they mess it up. That's what أفسدوها means. They make the best among them the lowest among them, and that's what they do. And that's the only.
And if they're not kings, they assign themselves like most of the dictators in the Arab world. They assign themselves as royalty, like their sons in courts and
I have some
Please.
comment also.
Please.
From your brief presentation, I couldn't surmise whether you proposed that there is a concept of caliphate in Islam, or there isn't?
There is it,
There isn't.
yes. Not a universal one.
Yeah, that's
Not
what I
a
mean.
universal.
That's the
Not a universal.
Maulana Maududi's concept or Jamaluddin Afghani's. So there is no. As
Well, I
well
mean, Jamaluddin Afghani is an entirely different issue.
Yeah,
he,
I mean,
he was not an Afghani.
Yeah,
but anyways,
but Maulana Maududi, the
yes.
Khilafat Hukumatullah or whatever he was. So I understand.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Just quickly, I can see where you make point to the fact that there is no precedent for an absolute authority or ruler based on the way the Khalifa is defined. But it seems to me that even in all the cases you explained, that there was some sort of absolute unity in some sort of government form, regardless of how powerful or not powerful the leader was. So, do you think maybe there may not be a precedent for absolute rule, but a precedent for a unified rule?
No, because there was never absolute unity. In fact, the people of Medina themselves were not united, and they were never united even after the leaders were chosen. When Abu Bakr was chosen, Ali never took the bay'ah until after Fatima died, and that's another interesting story.
But I mean, there were, you can have disagreements in terms of agreement and still have political unity. So I mean, there was political unity even if there weren't multiple states inside Medina. There was just disagreements, just like Republicans and Democrats disagree over who would be the best president.
Exactly.
There's still be one president.
Yeah. But not absolute unity, because there is no absolute unity, because we disagree on almost everything. And it's considered to be okay.
But in the form of a modern political state, there would be.
But that's a modern political state and not an Islamic state. Anything else?
Well, why don't we'll sure there'll be more questions at the end. This seems like it's working. I can certainly hear myself in a natural way. Okay. So you're going to have to all experience something horrible. My handwriting. This is actually me trying to write legibly. You don't want to see the normal handwriting. I don't know what happened to me. I look at my notes when I was in grad school. It's all very clear. Now, I think there's just some psychological stress that just, actually this isn't, I think I have now actually a learning disability. I think I could get, some of my students, their handwriting is so bad they get to use computers. It's technically learning disability. So suffer briefly, and then hopefully I'll be able to decipher everything for you. I thought I would just talk about kind of a history of the concept of caliphate and how it interacts with other notions of authority, or at least political authority, and concepts of political legitimacy in Islamic civilization. One of the first things to keep in mind in Islamic civilization is, as the great historian Marshall Hodgson called it, it's really better to call it Islamicate civilization. Islamicate civilization. Why? Because Islamic civilization suggests that everything is rooted in Islam, has some basis in Islam, is an expression of Islam. Whereas what actually happened historically is that the Muslim conquest of the Middle East led to the creation of an amalgamation of the pre-existing cultural, political, religious traditions of the Near East and Islam, and then expressed itself in an Islamic idiom. But lots of the institutions of Islamicate civilization, which ultimately spread from Morocco to Southeast Asia, many of those institutions, they're not mentioned in the Quran, they're not mentioned in the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. They're institutions that are developed either from pre-existing institutions that preceded Islam, or that Muslims came up with. Things like pious endowments, things like the madrasa, things like mosques, things like the idea of the Sultanate. These are all notions. The fact that you have someone in Brunei who calls himself the Sultan of Brunei, and in Malaysia is a federation of multiple states, each with its own sultan. The Quran never says, verily there is this notion of the Sultanate and this is what the office means. It's either something that was inducted maybe by Muslim scholars from their scripture and then used to describe existing notions of rule. And so it's actually these institutions like the Madrasa, the Sufi Brotherhood, the idea of Sultanate, the Sharia. These institutions are what bind together Islamic civilization. But not all of them are actually rooted in the original scriptures of Islam. So this is a very important distinction that Marshall Hodgson made and is very helpful. Amin's had to suffer through us and endlessly discussing this in our Islamic Civ class, where he was my TA for several years. Okay, so when you begin with I thought we'd just talk about sort of three concepts or idioms for talking about rule or authority that appear in the lifetime of the Prophet and in the immediate, let's say, 20 years after his death in 632 of the Common Era. One of them over here is imama. Imama means leadership generally. Now, if you look in not only in the hadiths of the Prophet, his sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which are problematic as a source because a lot of them are made up after the death of the Prophet by various competing factions in political, sectarian, legal disputes. So they oftentimes reflect existing disputes instead of really exactly what the Prophet said. But if we assume that there's some origin for this material in the early Islamic period, you can see it expressed there. And you also see it expressed in fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence when they talk about concepts of leadership. So if we talk, let's say, about the first 300 years of Islam, you have Muslim leadership is actually extremely important, just imama, for the theorization of authority, for the theorization of rule. Now, there's ambiguity here because the person who leads the prayer is the imam. So we could all pray right now and I could be the imam. And I have no authority over you, I just happen to be the person who leads the prayer. But the leader of the community is also called the imam. So Muslim legal scholars discuss the qualifications for imama as leadership of prayer, and they talk about the qualifications for imam as the leadership of the community. And there's the two overlap, because one of the things that the imam, the leader of a community, whether it's the leader of the Muslims overall, or the leader of a city, or the governor of a province, one of the things he's supposed to do is lead the community in prayer. But that ambiguity is important because you see that there's this overlap of religious leadership and temporal leadership. Now, the person who leads the prayer doesn't necessarily have any, like I said, the fact that I happen to think, certain thing is right or wrong in Islamic law, I have no right to force that upon the people whom I lead in prayer. But there is this notion of religious leadership in the sense of leading the community in prayer. The second concept is that of khilafah. That's the idea of successorship. And as you saw, this is the term that's invoked by Abu Bakr. He's the Khalifa, the successor of the Prophet of God. And the last one it's an R, I guess, Imara. Imara means command. So the word Amir is the active participle, or a noun from the verbal noun of Imara, of command. He's the commander. And oftentimes when the Prophet talks about commanders, he's talking about, I'm making someone a commander for a campaign. This person is your commander. You obey this person on this campaign. So it can be a commander in the limited sense of a military campaign, and it can be the commander in the greater sense of being the leader of the community. And that's, again, the term that Omar takes is Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful. And this is the most common term you'll see for the first, I'd say, at least 200 years of Islamic history. And any of my students, since I have so much respect for you, having either had no impact on you or had a lot of impact on you, any of you who think I've made a mistake and you want to correct me, please raise your hands. These two are very interested in political history. If you guys have any corrections, feel free to. I would guess around the first 200 years. Really, Amir al-Mu'mineen is what the leaders call themselves. Commander of the faithful. Now, so basically, time goes on. You have the first four caliphs who are often later termed the rightly guided caliphs, the Khulafa al-Rashidun. Abu Bakr rules for only 2 years. Omar rules for 10 years, is assassinated. Uthman rules for 12 years, assassinated, and Ali rules for 3 years, 4 years, is assassinated.
5. Almost 5.
656 and 660. For, let's say, 4 years.
When you say assassinated, you don't mean killed in battle, do you?
No, I mean assassinated, you know, like, I'm going to pray, like get stabbed in the back, assassinated. That's how Ali was. Uthman was killed in his house by a large group of disgruntled Muslims, and Omar was stabbed as well by an assassin.
But Ali was killed during a war.
No. He was killed when he was walking to. It was during a war in the sense there was a civil war going on, but he was walking to the mosque to pray in Kufa, and he was stabbed by a Kharijite assassin.
That's right.
Mujahid was his name. Okay. Then in the first civil war, basically starts about 656 to 660, and we won't go into what the different parties are, but the group that triumphs is the Umayyad dynasty, the Umayyad family, which then becomes the first dynasty. And this is, when you were referring to about the Prophet not liking kings, is in one hadith he talks about you'll have a certain number of rightly guided caliphs, and then you'll have Mulukun Abd, which is kings who bite, like kings who won't let go. They bite on and they just cling on. So there's this idea that kings don't really have legitimacy. And then you see this with the
in Allah's eyes.
Well, no, the king doesn't have legitimacy because a king, it's very clear in the time of the Prophet and Abu Bakr and Omar and Uthman and Ali that you don't become the ruler because your father was the ruler. You become the ruler through some kind of procedure. Yeah, there's not a dynastic notion. Whereas the Umayyads introduced the notion of dynastic succession.
Actually, Ali did too.
No, I mean if you're Shiite and then you believe that there's dynastic succession, but it's not dynastic succession just because you're the son. You have succession from the previous imam because your father happens to transfer to you. It's called nas, or this esoteric, perfect understanding of the religion. So your other sons are basically, they can go be cobblers or whatever they want to do, but they have no right to succession. The only person with right to succession is the one who receives the transmission of this authority.
The anointment.
Yeah. So it's not. When we talk about succession, dynastic succession, you're talking about. It's basically you're belonging to a certain family that gives you the right to rule. And that is introduced by the Umayyads. And of course the Umayyad dynasty makes their capital in Damascus from 660 until the late 740s when they're challenged by the last group that actually successfully overthrows them in 750, the Abbasid dynasty. This is a dynasty that starts out in northeastern Persia, but is led by a descendant from the Prophet's uncle Abbas. And so they take the name of the Abbasid dynasty. They build the city of Baghdad in the 760s, and that's the imperial capital until 1258. Well, they occasionally go to other places when they feel like it, but that's basically the capital until 1258 when it's sacked by the Mongols. Now, around, and there's no exact date here. Sometimes people like to talk about the year 945, but I think that's on the later end. From the mid-800s to the mid-900s, an important change occurs in this Muslim empire. It is one state. In 636, 637, the Muslims conquer Syria and Iran. In 650, in Central Asia, they've reached the city of Marv, which is now on the border between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Iran. In 711, they invade Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, and also Sindh in India. So you see this huge territorial conquest that occurs. And one of the features of pre-modern states is that if you have a large area of territorial control in theory, it's going to be actually very hard to control that in reality. States simply do not have the technology to do that. They don't have the technology in terms of communication, in terms of transportation, in terms of administration. So what happens is this, as long as you're expanding, you can maintain control because your armies, they're off fighting other people. The second you stop expanding, you have a problem, because now these armies are saying, well, what are we going to do now? Who's going to pay us? And if I'm not getting any spoils of war, someone's going to start paying me a salary. And if you don't give them a salary from the central government, then they eventually kind of carve out local statelets or states that are under the suzerainty of the central state, but in reality are pseudo-independent. So you get basically the emergence of local dynasties. This begins really in the early to mid 800s, and by the mid 900s it's become the reality. By the mid 900s, the Abbasid caliphs are no longer exercising any real temporal authority, except maybe just in Baghdad. Even then, they don't really, they're at that point a figurehead. And this is a process that begins, let's say, the mid 800s and completes in the mid 900s. At that point, you have by that time, a new mode of rule, conception of state has developed. You have the caliph, and this is really when the notion of the caliph becomes important. Before that, it's one of these things. When someone's really in power, they don't need to stress that they're in power. If someone's really the authority, they don't have to sit around talking about the authority all the time. They might not even have a title. They're just the person in charge. It's really when you have a splitting of, let's say, theoretical or nominal symbolic authority and actual temporal authority, then titles become much more important. So what happens in the mid 900s is this group called the Buyid dynasty. It's basically a band of warlord Turkic brothers they're Persians actually, from northeastern Iran. They come, they take over all Iran, they take over Iraq, and they go to Baghdad and they become the protector. They offer to become the protector of the caliph. And they rule under this title. They are the protectors of the caliph. But in fact, the caliph is now, in effect, as he had been for some time before that, actually a hostage, and under the control of whoever is really in charge. And this is where you have really a distinction between the sultan, which is the authority, and basically what that means is a military warlord. Unless you happen to live in, the Republic of Venice or the Republic of Ragusa, later Dubrovnik, most human beings in history live under some kind of military authority, because the person who has weapons and the ability to force people to obey and to provide their security will be the ruler. So the Sultan is really an effective military warlord of one form or the other. In the central Islamic lands from the 900s until the 1200s, they're either Persian or they're Turkic. In some cases, there's a few dynasties, local dynasties, like in Mosul, where they're Arabs, but most of the time they're Turkic or Persian. And so you have Sultan with an S, that's an S at the end in brackets, because there's not just one Sultan anymore. So the Buyids happen to control Iran and Iraq, but there's all sorts of other dynasties. There's the Ikhshidi dynasty in Egypt, there's dynasty in Tunis, there's dynasty in what's now Morocco, there's a dynasty in what's now Yemen, there's dynasty in parts of Iran outside of Buyid control. And these are all sultans. And in theory, they all recognize the nominal authority of the Abbasid caliph. They will print coins, if they mint coins, they mint coins with the title of the picture of the Abbasid caliph. If they, in their Friday prayer sermons, you hear prayers for the Abbasid caliph. So the Abbasid caliph, the caliph really continues to provide the overarching theoretical unity of Islamic civilization, of this Islamic State, even though in reality you have lots of different local authorities who are really in charge. This should have been over here, but I wrote it too early. 1258, important date, Baghdad falls, conquered by the Mongols. And people oftentimes, yes, is that a problem with that?
No, not a problem.
No, you disagree?
Just an exception to that the Fatimid the dynasty actually had a large territory, but did not adhere to the caliph.
Oh yeah, well, that's a good point. But I'll mention that. That's a good point. Yes, it's an important point, which I actually was planning to talk about. But even the term caliph doesn't become that important. So 945, the Buyids take over. Now, earlier in the 900s, a Shiite religious movement that began in Syria and then was defeated there and moved over into North Africa, what's now Algeria, and then with the help of this Berber tribe, basically takes over North Africa, and eventually in the 960s conquers Egypt and founds the city of, what's now the city of Cairo, in around 969. That, in the early 900s, that movement, which later becomes called the Fatimid dynasty, takes the title of caliph. So now, in the 920s, the title caliph it becomes really more of a currency of authority or currency of contention, because now there's more than one person claiming to be caliph. When the Abbasids were defeated in 750, the survivors of the Umayyad dynasty fled to Spain, and actually the Umayyad dynasty continued in Spain until around 1000 of the Common Era. And when they just called themselves the Emirs, the Amir al-Mu'minin. When the Fatimid Shiites called themselves the Caliph, then the Umayyads in Spain also called themselves Caliph. So around, I think it was the year 929. Can you check that for me, Amy? 929, is that correct?
I think so.
Okay, 929, the Umayyad ruler in Spain also calls himself the Caliph. So it's sort of like the period in the late 1300s and early 1400s in Italy and southern France when you have 3 popes. So now you have 3 caliphs.
Exactly.
So the reason why the term caliphate, one of the reasons it becomes more important is now a lot of people are claiming it, and so its currency rises. 1258, Baghdad falls to the Mongols, and most of the Abbasid family is wiped out. Not all of them, because some of them flee to Egypt. And actually, this is important, the Abbasid Caliphate continues in Egypt under the protection of the Mamluk dynasty until 1517. And that's not just, people sometimes think sometimes they call it the shadow caliphate. It's actually very important. And it's important not necessarily just for the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt and Syria, but Muslim states that are arising elsewhere in the Muslim world. At this time in the 1200s and 1300s is when you really have expansion of Muslim rule in India, in Central Asia, eventually in Southeast Asia in the 1400s and 1500s. The Delhi Sultans, who were really the first major dynasty in India, from 1192 until the late 1300s when they were destroyed by Tamerlane, in the early 1300s, they get a letter of investiture from the Abbasid Caliph saying, I recognize you as my legitimate representatives in India. And that's so important that this letter is always read at the Friday prayer. And the Delhi Sultans actually build a whole city. Now if you ever go to Delhi, there's an area called Kaus Khas, which now has really upscale, nice furniture shopping and good restaurants. But that actual area was called, it was built for a representative of the Abbasid dynasty. They built a whole little city just for a representative of the Abbasid dynasty to come. So an extremely powerful idea for legitimacy of Muslim rulers who are out there in what at the time were marginal areas. Now, so what happens in this period of, let's say, the 900s to the 1300s is the concept of caliphate becomes much less important. So you have this contestation over the title of caliph in the 900s and the 1000s. But by the late 1000s, early 1100s, the Fatimid dynasty is no longer a threat. The Umayyad dynasty in Spain has been conquered. And what really, you could say around maybe 1100 to going up into even the late middle, early modern period, the 1600s, the concept of caliphate is not very important anymore. Because by this time, it's really the notion of sultanate that is important. And it's not an Islamic notion of sultanate. It's a continuation of the pre-Islamic Near Eastern tradition of the Roman emperor and the Persian emperor, which is that the ruler is God's shadow on earth. The ruler is God's shadow on earth. The ruler deserves total obedience because it's also the ruler's duty to provide total justice. And this really becomes the mode of conceptualizing rule. And there's other streams that feed into this. So in the mid-1200s, when the Mongols invade the Middle East in 1250, and then you have a dynasty ruling most of Iraq and Iran until the early 1300s as a Mongol dynasty. And then the dynasty of Tamerlane from the late 1300s through the early 1500s, mid-1500s in the Middle East, and through the 1700s in South Asia. The dynasty of Tamerlane, there are Mongols. Tamerlane marries a descendant, a daughter, a granddaughter, or a great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan, and he rules as, his title is the son-in-law. Tamerlane Damad, Tamerlane the son-in-law, i.e. the son-in-law of Genghis Khan. Because from the mid-1200s until almost up into the 1800s, it is descent from the golden family of Genghis Khan that gives you the right to rule. This is a notion that's totally un-Islamic, right? This is from outside the Islamic tradition. Marshall Hodgson calls this the age of Mongol prestige. It is descent from Mongol heritage, especially the golden family of Genghis Khan, that gives you the right not only to rule Muslims, but the right to universal empire. And it's not only notion of universal empire that feeds into notions of legitimate rule in the Islamic tradition in this time, because in 1453, when the Ottomans conquer Istanbul, what do they start calling themselves? Constantinople is the capital of the Roman Empire. So who's the rule of the Roman Empire? It is Caesar. They call themselves Caesars. And they make the case to European monarchs that they have the right to universal empire because they are the inheritors of the Roman Empire. There's other ideas that you'll see, the notion of being the next Alexander the Great, going back to the pre-Islamic Near Eastern tradition of Alexander the Great receiving advice from his teacher Aristotle on how to be a just ruler. So Alexander the Great becomes the epitome of just rule, and also the example of conquest and favor from God. The idea of the renewer, that's the word renewer, which you can probably barely read, drawing on a hadith of the Prophet in which he says that every 100 years God will send a renewer for his religion. Another, here's the notion of descent from Genghis Khan, possessor of the fortunate conjunction. Not the most charismatic term in English, but in Arabic or in Persian, Sahib Quran, the one who owns or who comes at the time of a certain planetary conjunction. Here, this is going back to pre-Islamic Near Eastern traditions of astrology, that the heavens have will tell you when certain events are propitious. And so when Tamerlane conquers Damascus in the early 1400s, the famous Muslim historian and scholar Ibn Khaldun actually meets with Tamerlane. And Tamerlane asks him about, what do you think about my claims to rule and things like that. He says, you're the possessor of the fortunate conjunction. This is the time when the certain conjunction of planets has come about, and you have the right to universal empire because of that. And so let's take the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who rules from 1520 to 1566. You can see pictures of Suleiman the Magnificent, and over his head, or there are paintings of him, they'll be titled. It'll say, Padishah-e-Islam, the Emperor of Islam, Sahib Quran, the possessor of the fortunate conjunction, the Mahdi, the rightly guided person whose messianic figure is supposed to come at the end of time. 1591 was the year 1000 on the Islamic calendar. So around that time, people were also thinking in terms of messianic, the end of the world. And then somewhere on that list you find Caliph. Whatever, Caliph is just one of the things that these people are at this point. And another thing that's very important, I won't get into that actually. Well, maybe in the question. So Caliph is really not an important title at this point. Just one of the things you can be.
I think psychologically for the Muslim world, it was very important because when Mustafa Kemal abolished,
we're still in the 1500s. You're way ahead of us.
Well,
okay. So, what are some other things that Are you people are looking very antsy. Have you been listening for things for too long?
Yeah.
If this were a class, I would give you a break.
Bring us up to the modern world.
Okay. Why? You only want the modern world?
No, bring us that way. Carry us on.
1574.
This is great.
1574. Sorry, 1774. Interesting event happens. The Ottoman Empire loses its first chunk of territory that's actually majority inhabited by Muslims to the Russians. It loses the north shore of the Black Sea. And there's an agreement that the Ottomans come up with in the Treaty of Küçükçenarca in 1774 with Catherine the Great, where she acknowledges the Ottoman Sultan as the Caliph of the Muslims, even in Russian territory. Why is this important? Because what this means is now there's this idea that there's a Muslim ruler who's the Caliph. In this case, it happens to be the Ottomans, because they're just one of the people who are calling themselves Caliph in the 1700s. He is recognized by the Russians as the protector, or at least the sort of religious leader of the Muslims who live under Russian rule. By the mid-1800s, at that point, it's become very obvious to the Ottoman Empire, which at this point becoming increasingly weak, that various European countries, Great Britain, France, Italy, Russia, have designs on encroaching on Ottoman sovereignty. But nobody wants to actually destroy the empire, because that means someone else might take Constantinople. It's not the British or the Russians. They want to basically keep the empire propped up, but while increasing each country's own influence on the area of the Ottoman Empire. So what the Ottomans start doing in the mid-1800s is they realize that this notion of caliphate can actually be a very useful tool in foreign policy. By the way, later in 1517, when the Ottomans conquer Cairo, they actually, the last Abbasid caliph, Mutawakkil II, actually goes and surrenders to the Ottoman Sultan Selim the Grim. And Selim says, "Very nice to meet you," sends him back to Istanbul for a couple of years where he lives as a guest, and then he goes back to Cairo and dies there. Later on, in the 1700s and 1800s, you have this idea that Selim, the last Abbasid caliph, transferred the caliphate to Selim. There's no evidence this actually happened. Selim didn't write home. He wrote a letter home to his son saying, "I just conquered the entire Middle East." And he didn't say, "By the way, I am also the caliph now," in case that will impress you. There's no mention of this. It's not important. It's only later on in the late 1700s, the 1800s, that Ottomans start bringing out this idea that they're the caliph as something special. And not just item number 7 on the list of why they have the right to universal empire. So, for example, during the First War of Independence / the Indian Mutiny in 1857, the British asked the Ottoman Sultan to issue a ruling as the ruler in theory of Muslims around the world, the Ottoman Caliph, to say to the Muslim rebels, of course there was rebellion both by Hindus and Muslim soldiers, that you should not rebel against the British. It didn't work. But the point is, you can start seeing how the Ottomans realize they have this tool they can use. And in the last time this is used is in November 1914, when the Ottomans officially joined with the Germans in World War I. They issue a declaration of jihad to all the Muslims in the world, especially the ones living under British rule in India and North Africa, and France, right? North Africa, French colonies in North Africa, saying, fight with the caliph against the enemies of the caliph. God. So this becomes, that also doesn't really work. But you can see how this is becoming an important tool. Now, finally, we're now at the end, so you can all relax. 1924, the Turkish parliament, or the parliament of the new Republic of Turkey, abolishes the caliphate. And now, from the end of the World War I until 1924, and in fact beyond that, there's a movement that rises especially in South Asia, British India, called the Caliphate movement, which is really Muslims outside the Ottoman Empire, especially South Asia, emphasizing the importance of the Caliphate and urging the Turkish Republic not to, the authorities that take over after the fall of the Ottoman dynasty, not to abolish the Caliphate because of this, its important role as a symbolic leader in the Muslim world. And when it gets abolished in 1924, then you have real, it's not so much a crisis, but Muslims in especially the Middle East had looked to the Ottoman Empire as a potential political point of political rallying. And Muslims outside of the Middle East, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, had looked to the Ottoman Empire as a model for an alternative notion of modernity, a non-Western alternative of modernity. People don't remember this, but the Ottoman Empire had totally reformed its legal system, totally reformed its educational system, totally reformed its infrastructure, it had railroads, had everything, had telegraphs. In fact, they fought really well in World War I. A third of all the British troops were stationed in the Middle East on Ottoman borders. If the Germans had happened and the Ottomans had won World War I, people would look to the Ottoman Empire as this victorious. It was victorious because they had reformed, because they had modernized. So people looked at the Ottoman Empire with a sense of hope as a model for Islamic modernity. After they fall, that model is gone, and they have to, people have to look for other alternative models.
European generals running.
Okay, so that's kind of the history of
all concessions.
the Caliphate. How does this relate to ISIS? I would say it relates in this way. There is really no agreed upon list of what you have to do to be the caliph, or what you have to be the caliph. Some Muslim scholars said you have to be descendant of the Quraysh. The Ottomans weren't descendants of the Quraysh, and they didn't care. Because other major Muslim scholars, for example, Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni in the 1000s, he says Quraysh descent is not a requirement for the caliphate. So the Ottomans said, we're the caliphs, but we're not Quraysh, from the Quraysh tribe, because the Quraysh tribe is not a requirement to be the caliph. Only some Muslim scholars require the caliph to be, it's probably the majority. But historically, most of the people who claimed the title caliph from the 1500s onward were not Arabs. Not only were they not descendants of Quraysh, they weren't even Arabs. And they still claimed to be the caliphs. So why is it that the Ottoman claim to caliphate was believed, and a lot of the other dynasties that we didn't get into claimed to be caliph? Why is it we're not talking about them when we talk about the caliphs? Because the Ottomans happened to realize in the late 1700s to mid 1800s that the idea of being caliph and appealing as a religious authority to Muslims outside your territory, and in fact under European or under Christian rule, that this was a certain, gave you a certain leverage, potential leverage in relation to non-Muslim countries. And they used that, and this was believed by especially the European powers. And so that's what really gives us the idea that the Ottomans somehow are the bearers of the caliphate. And that in 1924, the end of the caliphate is some major moment. In reality, you could have a Turkic warlord who happens to take over all the Middle East and then gets up and says, I'm the caliph, and he would have pretty much just as much a right to do that as anybody else. What makes somebody followed as a caliph is their success as a state or as a leader. If you take over and you call yourself the caliph and you have a lot of power and you can command territory and defeat your enemies, you'll probably be considered a legitimate caliph. Okay, thanks very much, and we can now have questions for both of us, I guess. We don't have to look at my horrible handwriting anymore. Yes?
I notice in all the discussion I never hear the word mullah or ayatollah. Is that strictly Persian?
So mullah, I think, originally comes from Maulana. I'm not sure about that. Maulana meaning our master. But mullah becomes, I think it originates as a term in the Persianate world in the 1300s and 1400s. But then because the Ottomans themselves are, the state language of the Ottoman Empire until the mid-1500s is Persian. They're a Persianate dynasty, Persianate culture. So you see that word used by Ottoman scholars. But it just means, mullah means it's a scholar, basically, a religious scholar. Ayatollah is used in I think beginning in the mid-1800s in amongst the 12 Shiites in southern Iraq and Iran. It means sign of God, and now it means someone who's qualified to perform independent religious interpretation.
Can I make a comment? I think in the later part of the Ottoman Empire, as you said, in 1924, when British Parliament abolished the Caliphate, in India there was a huge reaction against the British, and the Indian Muslims wanted to restore the Caliphate. But it's a kind of contradiction because they were fighting for their own independence from the British, but there was a nationalism also in Arab countries. The Arabs, a lot of it revolt against the Ottoman is based on their own nationalism. They wanted to be independent, although they were all Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not strong enough to hold them under the Ottoman rule. So the Ottomans, the Arab revolt was sort of in contradiction.
So I think it's, we shouldn't go back and read history in the light of later events or in the light of Lawrence of Arabia, the movie. So it wasn't like there was some awakening amongst all the population of the Arab-speaking world that somehow they were Arabs and they should unite and have their own state that was going to rebel against the Turks. So the leader who leads the rebellion against the Ottomans, the king of Sharif Hussein of Mecca, and his two sons, right? He actually, if you look, he's pledging his loyalty both to the Ottomans and to the British. And in the end, the British offer him a huge amount of money, and he goes with the British. But it's really just he gets his followers and then a certain number of Bedouin tribes to follow him. And that's the army. Then, of course, has support from the British and then works alongside the actual British campaign in Mesopotamia and Palestine. So we shouldn't look at the Arab revolts as the entire world rose up. Arab world rose up against the Turks. If you look at the lists of people who belong to Arab nationalist organizations, that list is very small until 1918, at which point it balloons, because those people had previously been loyal Ottoman elite members, and now there's no longer any Ottoman Empire, so now they become Arab nationalists. So Arab nationalism, I think, really developed strongly after World War I, and really only strongly after World War II. It's not something I think that is an important force before.
I think it was incipient, but it would have grown given the time, because that's the history of the world is. I don't think. Do you think that Arabs would have consented to live under the Ottoman Empire much longer?
I think that the Ottoman Empire, its provinces were all falling off into various national causes. I'm not sure if that national cause would have been one of Arab nationalism as opposed to Egyptian nationalism or Southern Iraqi nationalism, or certainly there wouldn't have been Jordanian nationalism because there wasn't any.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, answer the question. Yes, why don't you ask?
What about the 1700s?
Yeah.
Daher Omar Zidani, southern Palestine, Akka Blad Safad, and southern Lebanon. He governed for 75 years.
Who?
Daher Omar Zidani. The center might know something about him because Brahim Sabbah was his minister. It was a secular, wasn't it, movement?
So the Ottoman Empire, like I said before, with all these pre-modern states, you have very limited central control. And the Ottoman Empire, it's an interesting empire, right? From the basically 1299, which is the usual date of the beginning of the empire, until its fall in 1920, 1922, 1924. There's not even another dynasty that is a serious competitor with them. I mean, this is a very long period of time to go without even a competing dynastic claim within the state. And that's because the Ottomans were very effective at convincing local populations that it was in their best interest to be part of this overarching system because they actually could have a lot of local autonomy. So people in what later on became the Mutasarrif of Lebanon, and later became states of Syria and Jordan and Iraq and things like that, these people often did live under the rule of local nobles, under various titles, many of them Christian, many of them Muslim. And so, I mean, this is one example of that. Yes?
So this is something I realized based on both of your lectures, and that is, so it seems like the idea of the caliphate the caliph isn't this powerful, all-powerful person. That's the first thing, not like the sultan. The second thing is that it did offer some sort of religious unity or legitimacy throughout its history. So could you then conceive that, even if the Arabs, you said, maybe want to have something, or the Egyptians or the Indians or whatever, you could still have that framework within the concept of some maybe elected or appointed leader who is the representative of the Muslim world, which you would call the caliph.
So the role of the caliph as a, let's say, conveyor of some kind of legitimacy or religious leadership is also contested. So scholars like Al-Ghazali died 1111. There's certain scholars like him who believe that if there's no caliph, nothing in Islamic law is valid. Your marriages aren't valid. Nothing is valid. You need the caliph to exist because the caliph, even if he has no power, the caliph is the source from which the entire system of the Sharia and Muslim religious life flows. Al-Ghazali's teacher, Al-Juwayni, says that's nonsense. The person whoever is in charge and has power and can establish justice, that's the caliph. And so he's much more functional about it. Al-Ghazali has this notion that you have to have this formal office of the caliphate, or else nothing Muslims do is really valid. And Muslims, since then, I think they kind of fall between these poles. The majority of them would, because they lived under some Muslim rule or another, they didn't doubt the Islamic legitimacy of their lives or of the state they lived in. This only becomes a problem when Muslims are living under states that are obviously not Muslim. So when the Muslims in South Asia or in India are living under British rule, non-Muslim rule, they're, especially after the 1770s when the British East India Company actually starts administrating areas and has Sharia courts that are run by British judges and things like that. There's a lot of debate amongst Muslim scholars in India. Are we still living in the abode of Islam? Are we still living in Muslim rule?
Could you have that exist, for example? Like, yes, there's maybe Muslims who live in the United States or Crimea or whatever, but that country, its political rule is that Muslims can accept that, but it's up to the caliph to basically represent their interests as well. So
I think that idea really only there was the question of how do you talk about non-Muslim minorities living in Muslim majority states? That's an issue that comes up throughout Islamic history, especially after the Christian kingdoms in what becomes Spain expand. After 1085 they conquer Toledo, 1236 they conquer Cordoba, etc., etc. The majority answer is that Muslims shouldn't live there. They should not live under non-Muslim rule. Another answer is that they can continue to live there as long as they're able to practice their religion freely. And if they're able to practice their religion freely, there's not really a question of their interests being spoken up for, because the only interest that matters for Muslim scholars whether or not you can practice your religion. If otherwise, it's nothing. No one cares. If you can't get a cheap house or something like that, that's not anyone's problem. So what you're talking about really comes up after the late 1700s, when you have the idea that European sovereigns can be the official protectors of religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire, like the Tsars of Russia are the official protectors of the Orthodox Church there. The French king is the French government is the official protector of the Catholics, etc., etc. Then, and you also the idea of the Muslims, then the Ottoman Caliph being the official protector of Muslim subjects. I think that's not. I don't know of any example, and I'm not sure if someone else does. I don't know any example where you could say that the Ottoman sultans after Küçük Kınarca somehow actually really had some important influence where they were able to better the condition of Muslims living under Russian rule. I can't think of any example. European rulers were certainly able to promote the interests of Christian minorities under Ottoman rule, but they could do it because they were powerful, and this was actually, for them, a way of exerting their authority, whereas the Ottomans didn't have that power.
But in the modern period, where you now have states that maybe are a little more powerful, or we have more international organizations that can communicate, work together to help, people in other countries, whether they be religious minorities or not. Do you think that a model like that is more practical, where you maybe we have a bunch of different Muslim countries based on ethnicity or whatever they want to be based on, but they still have some sort of confederation based on this caliph?
I mean, yeah, there's the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which I think was founded in 1957. I'm not sure exactly. You could have that if you took the head of the OIC and you just said this person is now the caliph. Yeah, I think that would in effect be what it is, right?
There are a couple of points that we can keep on looking at history, and we can keep on looking at concepts and see in today's world what are the claims and where do we go. First point that you brought up, that when in 1924 the Turkish parliament abolished Khilafah, that there was a huge outcry in India. In fact, that is not true. There was a Khilafat movement,
Yes.
but the Khilafat movement essentially consisted of two brothers, Muhammad Ali and Shawkat Ali. There was some stuff going on in the northwest, in the Pakhtun area, but they were more focused on the Hijra movement, which said if we want to defeat the British, we have to immigrate to Afghanistan, get ready, and then come back and attack. The reason I know about that is because my grandfather was assigned that role. It was a big failure, it was a huge failure. Muhammad Ali and Shawkat Ali went around looking for someone who would accept the title of Khalifa, just the title, and no one would agree. They even went to see Abdul Aziz, who had just started conquering the east and the Najd area. Okay? So it really is. It's a good story for the Indians to tell. But in fact, there was no huge Khilafat movement. And the people of the Middle East, especially in Lebanon and so on, they didn't like the Turks to begin with, mainly because they had become more oppressive, particularly in tax collection and so on.
You agree with what I was saying. The religious fact that the Ottomans have a common religion with Arabs or Muslim South Asians is not even that time sufficient to hold them together as an empire or as a caliphate.
No. In fact, the differences among Muslims, as I started to say from the beginning, the differences within the different groups have always been dominant, rather than the religious unity.
What about the Ummah? For all Muslims?
Well, no, actually the word Ummah for Muslims, the Quran uses the word Ummah for the people of all prophets. All prophets, that's called Ummah, and there are many Ummahs. And when the word, this is Ummatun Wahida, to the Prophet, it comes after a series of statements about other people. So you cannot even say it's talking about the Prophet. Inna hadhi ummatukum ummatan wahida. It's probably all of those other ummahs, and that you are a part of this ummah.
But I mean, certainly, the idea that Muslims worldwide belong to one ummah is extremely.
But he said the origin of it is multiple.
Well, I mean, it could be, but I mean, I remember the Prophet was talking to Christians and Jews and pagan Arabs and saying you all should become followers of Islam.
That's right.
So he was kind of making a call, but the idea that the Quran also says, خَيْرُ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ, you are the best ummah brought out for the people. And Muslims understood that to be talking about Muslims. So after the death of the Prophet, Muslims understand these references of ummah to mean the followers of the Prophet Muhammad.
But you don't need a khalifa to have an ummah. That's the point.
No, you don't need a khalifa to have an ummah. Yes.
Thank you both for your presentations. Dr. Chaudhry, I actually have a question about, so maybe I misheard you, but after you finished your presentation, you said that you don't think that it's possible to have an Islamic State because of there's not unity. You were talking about how
No, universal single state.
a universal single
A
state.
confederation is possible,
Mhm.
okay, but even that is problematic. And the reason is that the Muslims, you see, as soon as it went beyond Medina, it got to other cities, it became a problem immediately. Dr. Brown talked about, later people claiming to be sultans and so on, which is a little later. But in fact, Abdullah ibn Zubair, did not accept Yazid and declared himself Khalifa. He was a Khalifa for 12 years.
Around that, yeah.
Yeah. So as soon as you went from Medina to other cities, then there were more leaders. Okay? And therefore, you had to now rule by consensus. Okay? And then the nature of the rulers is they don't like consensus. And I think another point that we need to remember, the Umayyads are the people who took that leadership and made it into a kingship. They did not understand the Prophet. They were the latest Muslims. Okay? So they were not among his companions. They did not know what his thought was and so on. And they went to the Roman Empire, right? They go to Damascus, okay? Which is an entirely different culture. And they took all of the institutions from the thing. In fact, they didn't even make their own coins for decades. Okay? And when they did, they took a Roman coin and just changed something on it. Okay? So I think that the thing that is important is when we look at history, in retrospect, we can make it look smooth. Okay? This is like, when you teach science, everything looks great. But it doesn't when it is happening. It's always messy. So the question is, what is it that was common? And the answer is not much. Okay? But I think Dr. Brown made a good point. When you are expanding, it's easy to do things. Okay? But as soon as you stop expanding, then people, start asking questions. The Bu'ids were actually running the government. And in fact, even our Shia institutions, the Ghadir issue and the Muharram and so on, they were all established by the Bu'ids. Okay? So even the whole concept of the Shia Imamate is developed during the Bu'ids time, 10th century, 9th, 17th or something. Okay? So the thing is, you cannot look at history in retrospect and make it look pretty. Okay? But the thing is, the concepts are there. The question is, how universal were they? The answer is they were never really universal. And people disagreed as soon as more centers of power became available.
So my question is then so I'm really sort of a stickler on words, right? So I think that
Good.
when I think
Yes.
So like the Islamic State, sort of what Dr. Brown was talking about, like using Islamic State versus, using Islamic State. If you say the word Islamic, and maybe I'm being too simplistic, but I feel like who even posited in the first place that there could be a universal one? Doesn't Islam already provide, as a theology, room for pluralism in terms of thought of different leaders, this idea of consensus, this idea of representative government, this idea of religious freedom and minority rights? When you're talking about a state, we focused a lot on the concept of a ruler, of a power, but there's so much more that goes into a state than just a figurehead, which frankly I would argue is not even necessarily Islamic in that sense, sort of what you're arguing. Is that too simplistic?
Well, no, not really. But the thing is that the word Islamic itself is problematic. Because when you say Islamic, in a legal sense, which is you're a lawyer, there is not a single definition. Because we have, one of the things that I tell people, especially the academics, I said, our traditional way was to say we disagree. I think I'm right. I think you are wrong. But I accept the possibility that you could be right and I could be wrong. I mean, that was our tradition. Okay? And we always ended our documents by saying, Wallahu a'lam. Whenever there's a disagreement, well, God knows, here is my opinion. We have gone away from that, Wallahu a'lam, even in our scholarly discussions. And that's a problem. The second point that is important is we throw the word Islamic into everything now. Okay? We have Islamic centers and Islamic schools and blah. I mean, there's nothing Islamic about these schools, okay, or even these centers. Okay? They're just centers. So the word Islamic doesn't make anything Islamic. The question is, what are the principles involved? What are the authorities? Where do these authorities come from? Is there a consensus? If there's no consensus, it cannot be universal. Okay? And there is very little consensus, in fact. Okay.
I think the reason you don't see the term Islamic used to talk about states is because Muslims always ruled by other Muslims. And there's basically the only period that they're not is basically 1250 to around 1295 in parts of Iran and Iraq under the Sultanates, who then become Muslim. So it only becomes an issue, and as long as the ruler is Muslim, and the ruler says that the Sharia rules, and that can mean anything basically. There's no that state is considered legitimate by Muslim scholars. When does it become a problem? When you're clearly ruling people who are not Muslim and who have a totally different civilizational and religious vision than you, which happens basically in the colonial period. And in India, that happens in the late 1700s, and in the Ottoman world, that happens, Mediterranean world, that happens from the early 1800s on. And so that's when this becomes an issue. And that's when you start having movements calling of various stripes and various sorts, calling for some notion of Islamic rule. And when the Ottoman Empire collapses, and you have the last kind of great Muslim state goes out of existence, then people start looking for local Islamic movements, local Islamic states, to provide legitimate rule.
But look, even people like Maududi, who is the only one who's written stuff about this. Maududi never talks about a universal khilafah or universal state. He explicitly says, here is what we think should happen in Pakistan, and everybody else has to figure out their own way as to how to work. Yeah, there are, specific issues. What kind of a judiciary should we have? How about making sure that the laws that are made are not against Islam? Do you need 2 supreme courts? Okay. And he said no. Not just he said no, he had 17 scholars agree with him. He's the only one who has had meetings where bring everybody in and bring the Sufis and say, okay, let us discuss what the principles are. Okay. And even the question of simple thing, the head of the state should be a man, which he explicitly says in his books, right? But when in Pakistan in 1964, Fatima Jinnah was running against Ayub Khan, he supported her, and I went to his lecture. I was teaching in Karachi at that time, and he says, well, there are other requirements for being the head of a state. Okay? And I don't remember all of them, but he said one of them is being a man. And then he goes through each one of those. I couldn't hear everything, and he says at the end, he says, therefore, the only qualification Ayub Khan has is that he's a man, and the only disqualification Miss Fatima Jinnah has is that she's a woman. I mean, he backed down even on that one because there are other factors involved.
What about the Muslim qualification, the head of the government?
Huh?
Head of the government being a Muslim.
Yes, that one is. So
that's
there's
part of the constitution.
There's a good agreement on that. Yeah. But not a man. Yes.
I think
where this is going. On one of your first slides, Dr. Shafi, you talked about this calling for Islamic government as a response to corruption. So, bridging to what Dr. Brown just said before, the point at which in modern times what's being called for is the substance, not as much as the form of Islamic rule. They may have the title, and that might have been arrived at through all this historical discussion as a sort of will to power kind of form, or establishing the substance in one way or another. But what the substance is the criteria under which one carries out rule Islamically.
Well, I don't know that it's Islamic.
Well, but according to the criteria of justice.
So, I mean, I think a good example of what you're saying is that, since 1999, all the northern states of Nigeria, the Federation of Nigeria, declared Sharia law, right?
Yeah.
And people, Boko Haram's argument for why, they say, no, this is just political Sharia. It's a state. Basically, you guys arrest little thieves and deal with them according to Sharia law, and you have this huge corruption at the top levels and no one gets punished. So, but you're precisely right. I mean, I'm not advocating for Boko Haram or anything, but I mean, my point is, within one of their arguments is, actually this isn't Sharia because the big thieves, the great examples of corruption are being totally unaddressed.
Yeah, but the thing is, as far as the masses are concerned, they don't really care about the big issues. They know that the legal systems don't work in these countries. They know that the system up and down is corrupt. They know that the old systems, the tribal systems, really, because one of the things we forget is that most of these people, if you go to the tribal areas in Pakistan and Afghanistan and so on, they consider everything they do is Islamic. Okay. So because they think their tradition is Islamic, but the fact is the system worked. If there was a crime, they took care of it. Okay. If there was a case that went to the court, it was decided. It didn't stay there forever. You don't have in Egypt or Turkey now is improving, where the entire system is corrupt. Every single tier of the court system is corrupt. So what people are looking for is, we have these problems, and we cannot go anyone to come up with a solution. And maybe they want to use the word Sharia, but in fact what they say is let our local leaders decide. Really. In Afghanistan, even though we've been forcing the modern system on them, most of the decisions are still made by the tribal councils. And one American reporter complained that there was one case that went to the thing, and the guy who was in charge, he consulted 17 people. He said he was very upset with the fact that he consulted 17 people before he decided. Well, that's the way the tribal systems work, and that's the way the old Sharia systems work. You did not apply the law. You did justice, which was not always applying the law. And I think people are looking for solutions, is really what it is.
Are these societies destined to live?
Wait, hang on. There might be other questions before we have to leave. I want to make sure everybody who has questions gets a chance to ask questions. Mohammed, do you have a question? You're referencing something there.
I've got a jumbled collection of things I'd like some of them, but I mean, I'm going to try and limit myself because otherwise okay, so I think one thing that I wanted to kind of bring up in Dr. Shafi's presentation, I think there was much playing up of this kind of question of difference, which I don't think anybody would deny. But I think, on a few different points. For example, one, like how do we even use the term Islamic? What does that mean? There's other differences. That's one thing. Or then on the other hand, this question of, for example, there was never really any significance to the Khilafah because there was never one central thing. Again, I find it a little bit difficult to kind of contend with these kinds of presentations of the issues because the same way there are differences within liberalism or differences within communism, we still wouldn't know what liberalism or communism or democracy is. Same goes for Islam. Again, like it's a reference point to which people are making a claim when they are trying to say, you know, I'm operating within an Islamic framework. It can be broadly construed, it can be narrowly construed, and there's going to be differences of opinion over what that is, but I think that the use of the term in itself cannot be deemed illegitimate or out of bounds. People will make these claims. Same goes for, again, this question of the Caliphate or the Khilafah. Again, I think somebody had kind of highlighted this point that even within the differences of authority within Medina, it didn't mean that there isn't, you know, multiple governors or rulers within Medina. There was one system, and this kind of is a good segue, I think, to my second point, which is, again, I think the topic as it was kind of presented for this whole discussion was this question of the possibility like of a universal Islamic State, and obviously the presenters were kind of arguing against this. And I agree, I think if we're going to be talking about a conception of a universal Islamic State as in a very centralized thing where essentially you have one dictator at the top kind of doing you know, whatever he wants essentially. And I think again, even if you come to the modern period, you'll find very few groups that really are pushing for this. Maybe a group like ISIS might put this argument forward, and that's their conception of what it should look like, including all Muslim thing wherever, and just have this already down the top. But most Islamist groups even that advocate for this kind of thing, but they look at you have many other groups now, you have Hizb al-Ummah throughout the Middle East, you have Hizb al-Tajdeed, you have many of these groups, when they conceive of both, I think their conception of the Caliphate today, as they would kind of like to see it come into being, or for that matter, the way many of them theorize it historically, its historic existence, they don't conceive of it in that way as a kind of universal, centralized thing. They do have much more nuance in their kind of conception of the...
You mean they think of it as local, or they think of it as universal but highly decentralized, some kind of confederation?
Yeah, they think of it something more like a confederation or a commonwealth or something else, even, you know, in the theorization of the history of it. And again, I think another interesting point, like this question, this tension between kind of diversity and unity. Again, when you look at the layout of this presentation, there was this kind of, I think, attempt to kind of maybe play up this multiplicity and diversity within the history. But then when we actually had this kind of rundown by Professor Brown, despite the fact that yes, there are obviously periods where that is more salient than others, for a significant period throughout the history, and obviously again with different kind of salience, this idea of a central caliphate which everybody refers to, even if they're not really governed by it, was a very salient point. And it might have disappeared in this interim period, but then kind of came back towards the end of the Ottoman period. But I think that in itself is something very significant, and it is why throughout the 20th century and beyond, this concept of the caliphate remains so salient in, again, the demand of whether it's Islamist groups or otherwise. So again,
I think your points are very good, and I mean, I have to say, so, you know, I was brought in this presentation, I'm a pinch hitter or whatever, but I mean, from my own perspective, I'm not in the business of saying people should or should not make claims of universal states. I mean, that's, first of all, I mean, because I think people shouldn't be limited in their right to political ideology. But I think also that really plays into precisely the hand of groups like ISIS, which is that the main thing that leads people to support groups like that is because those groups call out hypocrisy of global systems or of Western-dominated systems. So there's the European countries can get together and say we want the European Union. You can have NAFTA. You can have Irish Americans who identify as Irish and some money to support Irish causes, and Jewish Americans who some money to support Israel, right? So everybody has acknowledged right to some kind of, it's the notion of contrariety with others with whom they identify across hundreds of nation states. And even you have the right to notions of supranational unions or of various sorts. And in fact, there's already organizational Islamic cooperation. Why is it that in Great Britain, in the UK, believing in a caliphate is something that will get you put on a list as an Islamic extremist, right? Where it technically, from the majority of Muslim scholars throughout history, they will tell you that Muslims are required to believe in the Caliphate. As we just discussed, that can mean a lot of things. It can mean that somewhere way off there's some guy who happens to be called the Caliph who has no role in my life, but he exists and that legitimizes my religious contracts. That's very different from saying, I'm going to respond to Abu Bakr Baghdadi's call and I'm going to go and kill someone in the street. These are two totally different phenomena, right? But I actually think it's important, if you believe in freedom of expression and in freedom of belief, and freedom of religious ideology, that people be allowed to identify with supranational organizations. Because otherwise you're basically saying Muslims don't have that right, but everyone else does.